khỏi nhất có thể. Và bây giờ tôi xin phép giới thiệu giáo sư và diễn giả nổi tiếng của buổi hội thảo trực tuyến ngày hôm nay, giáo sư Peter Hudis. Giáo sư Hudis là giáo sư triết học và nhân văn nổi tiếng tại Cao đẳng Cộng đồng Oakton. Ông là giáo sư tác phẩm có ảnh hưởng bao gồm khái niệm về sự thay thế của chủ nghĩa tư bản của Marx, được phát hành bởi Brill, và Frantz Fanon, triết gia của Thành lũy, xuất bản bởi Pluto vào năm 2015. Ngoài ra ông còn biên tập tuyển tập The Rosa Luxemburg Reader và The Letters of Rosa Luxemburg. Peter Hudis mang đến rất nhiều kiến thức và chuyên môn cho buổi thảo luận của chúng ta ngày hôm nay, và những hiểu biết sâu sắc của ông chắc chắn sẽ làm sáng tỏ sự phê phán chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái từ phía cánh tả Do Thái. Chúng tôi rất vinh dự khi chào mừng ông và chúng tôi háo hức mong đợi những ý tưởng kích thích tư duy mà ông sẽ chia sẻ. And now I will proceed to the introductory remarks in English. Welcome to today's online webinar, where we will explore the topic of the critique of Zionism from the Jewish left. I will first begin with a brief outline of our webinar today. We will first start with Professor Hudis' speech in English, and after his speech concludes, I will then provide a brief summary of it in Vietnamese. During this period, you can pose questions to Professor Hudis in the comment box, and I will read some select answers. You can ask the question in English, and Professor Hudis' answer will be translated into Vietnamese for fellow participants. Before we begin, I would like to outline a few courtesy rules and final requests all participants to abide by during this webinar. We would like to request all participants to turn off their microphones throughout the session. If you have any questions, please type them out in the chat box. Anyone who intends to disrupt the meeting by deliberately opening the microphone or the video feed will be kicked out of the room. We also expect all participants to maintain a respectful atmosphere. Do not make any discriminatory, offensive, or derogatory remarks towards any individual or group. And to ensure a smooth flow of the webinar, please keep your questions and comments concise and to the point in the chat box. This will enable us to cover a broader range of perspective and address as many queries as possible. Now, let me introduce our distinguished author and speaker for today's webinar, Peter Hudis. Professor Hudis is a renowned professor of philosophy and humanities at Oakton Community College. He has authored several influential works, including Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism and Frantz Fanon, philosopher of the Barricades. In addition, he has edited the magisterial volumes, the Rosa Luxemburg Reader and the Letters of Rosa Luxemburg. Professor Hudis brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our discussion today, and his insights will undoubtedly shed light on the critique of Zionism from the Jewish left. We are honored to have him with us, and we eagerly anticipate the thought-provoking ideas he will share. The floor is yours, Professor.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and have a chance to directly dialogue with Vietnam young Marxists and, of course, with everybody else who's here in the webinar. So I'm looking forward not only to having things to say to you, but also learning from yourselves in the discussion that follows, and looking forward to further relationships with you. So let me begin by first of all, doing a little screen sharing that might make it a bit easier to follow some of the main points of my presentation with a little bit of a PowerPoint, and then can get started. So let's make sure this is okay. I think it's still disabled, the screen sharing. So I don't think I can screen share right now.
Yes, I am fixing that right now. Sorry, Professor.
Okay.
Yeah. Have you pressed the share screen button? Does it show?
Yeah, okay, now it's coming up. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, thank you.
Okay, so can you see this, everyone? Is that visible on your screens?
It is now. Thank you, Professor.
This is visible?
Yes, this is
Okay,
visible,
thank
Professor.
you very much. Okay, so let me begin with stating that in response to Hamas's October 7th attack, Israel has clearly sunk into the depths of utter barbarism. Its indiscriminate war against Hamas, which does not distinguish on Israel's part civilians from combatants, is clearly genocidal. Now, this is shocking, but it is not surprising, since this kind of inhumanity is consistent with what the Israeli state has actually been doing for decades. Clearly, Israel's rulers have betrayed the most important lesson of the Holocaust, namely, never again. To Jews who first uttered these words, it meant genocide must never happen to anyone. To Israel's rulers and its apologists today, it means never again a genocide against Jews while fomenting genocide against Palestinians. This is having a terribly destructive influence on Israel and upon those Jews and others who support its policies. Israel's half-century of occupation of Arab-majority areas has clearly dehumanized the occupiers. Now, in my view, speaking as a Marxist humanist and as a Jew, Zionism has done as much damage to the soul of the Jewish people as the Holocaust did to its body. But I wish to emphasize, there are two worlds in every country and in every community. This is a basic principle of Marxism. Never identify the rulers with the rule. Zionism is not identical with Jews or Judaism, nor does it speak for Jews or Judaism. The one thing that the Israeli state and its supporters have in common or share with the reactionary Islamic fundamentalists of Hamas, as well as Hezbollah, is that they both deny this basic fact. The principles of social justice, which was integral to what it meant to be Jewish for centuries, is being buried today under a pile of rubble by a state that claims to speak in its name. But we must not become ideological accomplices to this crime by presuming that there is a straight line from the Jewish struggle for self-determination and Zionism. The two are not the same. Now, I want to just state here that the Jewish people have always felt an important bond to Jerusalem and the Holy Land, but that has no inherent connection to Zionism. For religious Jews, traditionally, the return to Jerusalem would come with the Messiah and the Day of Judgment. It had nothing to do with creating a neo-colonial settler state. For secular Jews, any return to Jerusalem was seen as pointless, for they sought to achieve religious and civil emancipation within the diaspora, within the dispersion of Jews around the world. Now, the vast majority of Jews opposed Zionism prior to the 1940s, and a significant minority of Jews oppose Zionism today. Israel and its allies are working to deny this by weaponizing the charge of anti-Semitism against its critics, or anti-Jewishness against its critics. This charge of anti-Semitism is not just directed at non-Jews who criticize Israel, it is directed against Jews who oppose Israel's policies as well. Now, clearly, anti-Jewish hatred is growing around the world. It's a major problem, including within sections of the anti-imperialist left. But let's be clear, most of today's anti-Semitism comes from right-wingers who strongly support Israel, in part because they hate Muslims above all else. What we are facing today is Zionist anti-Semitism. For example, just to give one example, the Norwegian far-right terrorists, Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in Norway in a terrorist attack, is an anti-Semitic neo-Nazi who supports Israel. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek has described this ideology as anti-Semitic but pro-Israel, because Breivik views the Israeli state as the first line of defense, as he put it, against Muslim expansion, end quote. So the Zionist claim that any criticism of Israel is anti-Jewish actually fuels anti-Semitism by telling anyone who opposes Israeli occupation of Palestine means that they must hate Jews. Now, what's a Palestinian youth whose family has been slaughtered by a 2,000-pound Israeli bomb supposed to think when they hear this endless narrative that opposing Israel means hating Jews? Obviously, many who do not know the actual history will conclude that they indeed must hate Jews. For this reason, I want to review some history, although all too basic history, but all too briefly at the same time. So, it's going to be a number of points I want to single out here. The first being, number one, that Zionism is a recent development. It arose from a small number of European or Ashkenazi Jews in the late 1800s in response to the rise of racialized anti-Semitism. Anti-Jewish hatred was integral to all European Christian societies for centuries. But the predominant view before the 1800s was that if a Jew converted to Christianity, they ceased to be a Jew. Anti-Semitism, with some exceptions, was not racialized yet. This changed, however, by the late 1800s, when having Jewish blood meant that you were a despised Jew, whether you changed your religion or not. Second, most Jews did not respond to the racialized anti-Semitism by becoming Zionists. This included groups like the Bundists, Jewish Marxists in the Russian Empire, who rejected Zionism and argued for Jewish cultural autonomy and self-determination within Poland and Russia. There were also Jewish communists who argued that anti-Semitism will only be ended by abolishing capitalism and who opposed creating a Jewish national entity. And many liberals also initially opposed Zionism. Let me quote what the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, that helped define Reform Judaism in the United States, stated in its founding declaration. I quote, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a restoration of any of the laws concerning a Jewish state," end quote. Okay, third, early Zionists were fully aware that many Jews were opposed to Zionism, and that's one reason why they tried to gain support from imperialist state powers to obtain a homeland in Palestine. Initially, the Zionists sought an ally in the Ottoman Empire, but that failed. They then sought an alliance with Tsarist Russia. The founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, actually visited Russia, and he asked Vyacheslav von Plehve, who was the Tsar's anti-Semitic minister of the interior, who instigated terrible pogroms against Jews, to help the Zionists convince Jews not to be socialist, but instead go to Palestine. In other words, Herzl directly tried to work with one of the leading anti-Semites in the Tsarist Empire to convince Jews to leave Russia and go to Palestine. But that too failed. By 1917, the Zionists appealed to the British Empire to support them. The result was the infamous Balfour Declaration, which called for a Jewish homeland in Mandate Palestine, then a British colony. Clearly, the Zionist project from its inception sought alliances with various forms of Western imperialism and colonialism. And there's no question that without at least tacit, if not always open support from the British, the Zionists would not have succeeded in getting so many Jews to migrate to Palestine prior to 1948. Fourth, it is vital not to oversimplify the history of Zionism. It was not always a monolithic movement. Many early Zionists were anti-imperialists, such as labor Zionists and socialist Zionists. Some of them wanted a Jewish state, but others did not. They wanted a homeland, not an exclusively Jewish state. For example, left-wing Zionists like Martin Buber and Hans Magnus favored a binational Jewish-Palestinian state. Martin Buber stated in 1922, and I quote, "If Jews and Palestinians do not learn to live together, there will be 100 years of bloodshed between us." That was stated 102 years ago. Actually, Jews and Palestinians did live peacefully together in Palestine and other Arab lands prior to the 20th century. About 6% of Palestine was Jewish as of 1900, since many Jews had never left the area. But the peaceful relations between Jews and Palestinians was destroyed by the excesses of Zionism. Okay. Fifth, the early Zionists were not religious. Most were atheist or secular. Religious Jews only began to support Zionism in large numbers after the creation of Israel in 1948. The secular Zionist right also grew in support after the creation of Israel. Now, right-wing, or revisionist Zionism, as it was called, emerged in the 1920s, led by Zeb Jabotinsky, one of the most important figures in the 20th century, in my view. He was a fascist, an admirer of Mussolini, and a demagogue who promoted the ethnic cleansing of Arabs. He was the intellectual father of the Likud party that runs Israel today. At the time of the creation of Israel, revisionist Zionism had the support of perhaps 15% of Zionists, but their influence outweighed their numbers. They initiated the Deir Yassin and other massacres of Palestinians during the War of 1948. They finally got power in 1977 under Begin, Shamir, and then Netanyahu. In my view, it was only a matter of time before right-wing Zionism would win out, since the continuous process of taking over and occupying Palestinian land had a corrupting influence on most Israelis. Once one favors a Jewish state with all Jews having the right to return, it is necessary to establish and maintain a Jewish majority. Otherwise, the entire Zionist project collapses. Hence, Zionism had to, from the beginning, involve the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. 6. Occupation has a corrupting influence, including on victims of a Holocaust. It is only after the Holocaust that Zionism became widely accepted among Jews. And after the 1967 war, the Zionism that most Israelis accepted became increasingly reactionary. Now, here is the tragedy of Zionism. One of the most oppressed people in the history of humanity now became, with Israel, the colonial oppressors in dispossessing Palestinians. However, it's important not to read history backwards or read things back into history based on the present day and assume that the formation of Israel was a product of a Western conspiracy. The British relation to Zionism was complex and uneven. Sometimes they favored the Jews, other times Britain favored the Arabs. Sometimes Britain allowed Jews to enter Palestine, other times it prevented Jews from entering Palestine. The United States did support the creation of Israel in 1948, but it was not until 1967 that the US gave total support to Israel. In 1956, it opposed Israel's conquest of Egypt's Suez Canal and forced its army to withdraw. So, what is often overlooked, especially, is the role of the Soviet Union in the formation of Israel. The Soviet Union cast the deciding vote at the UN Security Council in 1947 that created Israel. Now, why did the Soviet Union do this? In 1947, Arab regimes that opposed Israel's creation were semi-feudal monarchies that were fiercely anti-communist, whereas Israel had a strong communist party that had a significant, with at least about 10% support among the populace. The Soviet Union at first was more interested in relations with Israel than with the Arab regimes. By no accident, the weapons used by Israel to defeat the Arabs in 1948, the year of the Nakba, largely came from Czechoslovakia, a satellite of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union only switched to support the Arabs by the 1950s. Now, the 1948 Nakba that expelled 600,000 Palestinians, maybe a little more than that, from their land, followed by Israel's alliance with neo-colonial France and England in its 1956 war and its total alliance with the United States during and after the 1967 war, moved Zionism even further to the right. By the 1980s and 1990s, socialist and even liberal Zionism was a passing memory. Israel's occupation of millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, plus discriminatory policies against Palestinians in Israel, turned an oppressed national minority into an oppressive state power, determined to make the Palestinians disappear, if not literally, at least by making it impossible for them to have a voice. Israel's ongoing destruction of Gaza is the logical culmination of this process. One thing that explains the viciousness of Israel's attack is that October 7th showed the world that the Palestinian struggle for self-determination has not and will not disappear, which is deeply disturbing and frustrating to the Israeli ruling class. Now, this does not excuse Hamas's inhumane attack on Israel of October 7th. It was a horrific crime. Murdering civilians and taking infants and old people as hostages is a crime against humanity. But let us not forget that Israeli policies planted the seeds of these crimes. Israel has deliberately tried to manage its occupation in a way that ensures that the reactionary fundamentalists in Hamas and the corrupt Palestinian Authority on the West Bank are its only face of opposition. It works energetically to prevent any Palestinian voice, independent of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, from being formed or heard. We must not become accomplice in this by assuming that Hamas is a viable alternative to Zionist occupation. Does it make any sense to argue that since Israel is a colonial settler state, that the creation of a free, that since it's a colonial settler state, that the creation of a free Palestine means the Jews will have to leave or be killed? No, that would be absurd. There are 7 million Jews between the river and the sea. The Jewish West Bank settlers must be removed, but you cannot cast out or eliminate 7 million people without a national liberation struggle repeating the same mistake as Zionism. Israel is not the first example of an oppressed people becoming the new oppressors, but let it be the last. So here I conclude. Simply put, Jews and Palestinians are stuck with each other. Neither are going anywhere. They have to find a way to live together in peace. The only way out is a political solution that recognizes Jews and Palestinians as equal citizens, bearing the same human rights, free of domination and exploitation. Distant and difficult as such a goal is, we cannot give up the possibility of reaching for it. As Frantz Fanon, a firm supporter of the Vietnamese Revolution, wrote in his famous book, The Wretched of the Earth, and I quote, I'll finish here, quote, hatred, resentment, and the legitimate desire for revenge alone cannot nurture a war of liberation. These flashes of consciousness, which fling the body into a zone of turbulence, where my blood calls for the blood of the other, this passionate outburst in the opening phase disintegrates if it is left to feed on itself. Of course, the countless abuses of the colonialist forces reintroduce emotional factors into the struggle, give the militant further cause to hate and new reasons to set off in search of a colonist to kill. But day by day, leaders will come to realize that hatred is not an agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the informative, comprehensive, and I would say a devastating critique of Zionism that is very much worth thinking about. And now, in accordance with our prearranged schedule, I will now begin my Vietnamese translation of your speech. If anyone in the comments would like to pose some questions to the professor, you are free to post it in the chat box, and maybe the professor may read and answer some of the salient ones in our Q&A sessions. Thank you very much. Và đó là bài thuyết trình bằng tiếng Anh của giáo sư Hudis. Theo kế hoạch đã chuẩn bị trước thì đây sẽ là phần tóm tắt nội dung bài thuyết trình của giáo sư bằng tiếng Việt. Trước hết, giáo sư Hudis chỉ trích phản ứng của Israel trước cuộc tấn công của Hamas, cáo buộc nước này tham gia vào hành vi tàn sát bừa bãi và cáo buộc họ phạm tội diệt chủng. Ông cho rằng hành động của Israel mâu thuẫn với bài học về nạn diệt chủng Do Thái, từ giờ trở đi sẽ được gọi là Holocaust, nhấn mạnh tầm quan trọng của việc ngăn chặn nạn diệt chủng đối với mọi nhóm người trên thế giới, không chỉ người Do Thái. Ông tuyên bố rằng việc Israel chiếm đóng các vùng lãnh thổ Ả Rập đã làm mất nhân tính của những kẻ chiếm đóng người Israel và làm tổn hại đến tâm hồn của chính người Do Thái. Ông so sánh nó với chính những hiện tại về thể chất do nạn diệt chủng Do Thái gây ra. Giáo sư cũng khẳng định rằng chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái không nên bị đánh đồng với đạo Do Thái hay bản sắc Do Thái, nhưng nhà nước Israel cũng như người ủng hộ họ phủ nhận sự phân biệt này. Giáo sư cho rằng công bằng xã hội, thứ vốn có tầm quan trọng trong lịch sử đối với đạo Do Thái, đang bị làm lu mờ bởi các hành động của nhà nước đang đại diện cho người Do Thái. Giáo sư kết luận rằng cách tuyên bố cuộc đấu tranh giành quyền tự quyết của người Do Thái và chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái là hai thứ không đồng nghĩa với nhau. Tức là cuộc đấu tranh giành quyền tự quyết của người Do Thái và thứ đang xảy ra ở Israel là hai thứ không đồng nghĩa với nhau. Tiếp đến, giáo sư lập luận rằng mối quan hệ giữa người Do Thái và Jerusalem về mặt lịch sử thực chất mang bản chất tôn giáo hơn là gắn liền với chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái. Những người Do Thái sùng đạo gắn kết việc trở lại Jerusalem với sự xuất hiện của Đấng Messi, trong khi những người Do Thái thế tục không thấy việc quay trở lại thành phố này có ý nghĩa gì, mà tập trung vào việc đạt được sự giải phóng cho cộng đồng hải ngoại. Phần lớn người Do Thái phản đối chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái trước những năm 1940, và một thiểu số đáng kể, bao gồm giáo sư, vẫn phản đối nó cho đến ngày nay. Giáo sư gợi ý rằng Israel và các đồng minh của giáo sư đang vũ khí hóa cáo buộc bài Do Thái để bịt miệng những người chỉ trích, bao gồm cả những người Do Thái phản đối các chính sách của Israel. Ông thừa nhận rằng chủ nghĩa bài Do Thái là một vấn đề đang gia tăng trên toàn thế giới, nhưng ông cho rằng phần lớn vấn đề này xuất phát từ các cá nhân cánh hữu ủng hộ Israel. Hiện tượng này, như giáo sư Triết Slavoj Žižek, được coi là chủ nghĩa bài Do Thái nhưng ủng hộ Israel. Giáo sư tuyên bố rằng việc dán nhãn bất kỳ lời chỉ trích nào đối với Israel là chống Do Thái thực sự mang bản chất thúc đẩy chủ nghĩa bài Do Thái bằng cách đánh đồng với việc phản đối sự chiếm đóng của Israel với việc căm thù người Do Thái. Giáo sư đưa ra ví dụ về một cảnh kẻ khủng bố cực hữu Anders Breivik vừa bài Do Thái lại vừa thân Israel, và coi nhà nước Israel như là một biện pháp bảo vệ chống lại sự bành trướng mở rộng của người Hồi giáo ở Trung Đông. Giáo sư kết luận rằng câu chuyện liên kết việc phản đối Israel với lòng căm thù người Do Thái có thể khiến người Palestine và những người khác lầm tưởng rằng họ phải ghét người Do Thái dựa trên hành động của Israel. Giáo sư Hudis đưa ra lời giải thích về nguồn gốc của chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái. Nó nổi lên vào cuối những năm 1800 như một phản ứng chống lại chủ nghĩa bài Do Thái đặc biệt đang gia tăng. Tuy nhiên, không phải tất cả những người Do Thái nào cũng đều chấp nhận chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái. Nhiều vấn đề thay thế khác như quyền tự chủ về văn hóa của người Do Thái hoặc sự kết thúc của chủ nghĩa tư bản đã được đề ra để chống lại chủ nghĩa bài Do Thái. Hơn nữa, những người theo chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái ban đầu không nhận thức rằng quan điểm của họ không được ưa chuộng, nên họ đã tìm cách liên minh với các thế lực đế quốc như đế quốc Ottoman, Nga Hoàng và cuối cùng là đế quốc Anh, dẫn đến tuyên bố Balfour năm 1917 về việc thành lập quê hương của người Do Thái ở Palestine. Giáo sư Hudis cũng nhấn mạnh rằng phong trào chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái không phải là một khối đồng nhất. Một số người ủng hộ việc thành lập một nhà nước hai quốc gia Do Thái Palestine, trong khi những người khác, những người theo chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái cánh hữu, thúc đẩy việc thanh lọc sắc tộc người Ả Rập. Chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái cánh hữu có thể có được ảnh hưởng theo thời gian, dẫn đến sự trỗi dậy của đảng Likud ở Israel. Quá trình chiếm đất của của Palestine đã làm hỏng dự án phục quốc của Do Thái và dẫn đến bi kịch những người bị áp bức, tức là những người Israel, trở thành chính những kẻ áp bức. Giáo sư Hudis cũng nhấn mạnh rằng sự hình thành của Israel không phải là kết quả của âm mưu phương Tây, nhưng Anh và Mỹ có mối quan hệ phức tạp và nhiều biến động với chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái. Tuy nhiên, điều hay bị bỏ qua là vai trò của Liên Xô trong việc thành lập Israel, bởi vì nước này ban đầu ủng hộ sự hiện diện của một đảng cộng sản mạnh ở Israel và sự phản đối các chế độ Ả Rập chống cộng sản. Tuy nhiên, Liên Xô sau đó đã chuyển sang phe hỗ trợ phía Ả Rập. Thảm họa Nakba năm 1948 khiến hàng trăm nghìn người Palestine phải di rời. Tiếp theo là các liên minh của Israel với Pháp và sau đó là Mỹ đã đẩy chủ nghĩa phục quốc Do Thái tiến xa hơn về phía cánh hữu. Việc chiếm đóng các vùng lãnh thổ của người Palestine và các chính sách phân biệt đối xử đã biến một dân tộc thiểu số trở thành một cường quốc áp bức. Việc Israel phá hủy Gaza được coi là đỉnh điểm của quá trình này. Giáo sư cũng muốn nhấn mạnh rằng cuộc tấn công của Hamas và Israel là xứng đáng bị lên án, là tội ác chống lại loài người, và không nên cho rằng Hamas là một giải pháp thay thế khả thi cho sự chiếm đóng của Israel. Tuy nhiên, điều quan trọng cần nhớ là các chính sách của Israel đã góp phần vào tình hình hiện tại bằng cách bóp nghẹt tiếng nói độc lập của người Palestine. Cả người Do Thái và người Palestine phải tìm cách cùng tồn tại trong hòa bình, công nhận quyền bình đẳng của nhau và bác bỏ sự thống trị và sự bóc lột. Và cuối cùng, giáo sư Hudis kết thúc bằng câu nói của Frantz Fanon, một triết gia ủng hộ chiến tranh, ủng hộ của cách mạng Việt Nam, rằng hận thù, oán giận và mong muốn trả thù chính đáng không thể nuôi dưỡng được một cuộc chiến tranh giải phóng. Những tia ý thức này đẩy cơ thể vào một vùng hỗn loạn, khiến tôi đòi máu của người khác. Sự bùng nổ đam mê này trong giai đoạn mở đầu sẽ tan rã nếu nó được để yên và để tự diệt. Tất nhiên, một số hành vi lạm dụng lực lượng thực dân đã đưa lại các yếu tố cảm xúc vào cuộc đấu tranh, khiến cho người chiến binh có thêm lý do để căm ghét và những lý do mới để lên đường tìm kiếm thực dân để giết. Tuy nhiên, ngày qua ngày, các nhà lãnh đạo sẽ nhận ra rằng sự hận thù không phải là một chương trình nghị sự khả thi. Và đấy là bài thuyết trình của giáo sư Hudis. And that concludes my Vietnamese summary of your speech. Thank you very much, Professor. And then we will now proceed with some of the salient questions posed by the audience. You are free to answer the questions, Professor, and I may or may not translate it into Vietnamese. I might not translate it into Vietnamese if we don't have the time, but you are free to answer them in English.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. Do you have any particular ones, or would you like me to pick from the chat?
Yes, Professor. You can freely pick any one you would like to answer in the chat box.
Well, thank you very much for these questions. They're very, very appropriate for the discussion that we're having. And so let me just take them in order. First, the question of what were the circumstances that led Jabotinsky to promote the ethnic cleansing of Arabs? I mean, Jabotinsky founded the wing of Zionism, which essentially argued that, from the beginning, argued that Zionism has to pretty much adopt the kind of narrow nationalist ideology that had become predominant in Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So an ethnically exclusive nationalism was what Jabotinsky said was the only hope of the Jewish people. Now, Jabotinsky is a very interesting fellow because in the 1920s, he predicted that within the next generation, the European Jews will be exterminated. The only other two people I'm aware of who made that prediction, well, the only one at the 1920s that I'm aware of was Franz Kafka, the great Jewish novelist. So Jabotinsky was both insightful and also demagogically pessimistic about the future of Jews and Judaism in Europe, and concluded from what he saw as the coming Holocaust 20 years before it happened, that the only hope for the Jews was to do what other narrow nationalisms elsewhere in Europe had done and were doing, which is to carve out an ethnically pure Jewish state. Now, unlike Herzl, who knew nothing about Palestine, he didn't even mention Arabs pretty much in his book, the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, that was the manifesto of the Zionist movement in the 1890s. Jabotinsky did know that the Arabs were there. He did know that they had a long history and were deeply rooted to the land. And that made him even more determined to try to forcefully evict them. So this is the fascist wing of Zionism, which at the time was denigrated by much of the rest of the Zionist movement, but over time became the predominant ideology because he was the intellectual father of indirectly of Netanyahu. Even not indirectly, Netanyahu's father, for people may not know, was a very famous a historian who wrote a 1,000-page magnificent study of the Spanish Inquisition, a very esteemed historian who lived to be 101 years old, by the way. And on his deathbed, he made his son, Netanyahu, promise that he would never allow the Palestinians to have their own state. He made him promise that on his deathbed. That was about 15 years ago, and Netanyahu has fulfilled his father's wish. What can be said about that, but I'll try to be brief. Okay. A really interesting question from Uyen Fran about how any insights in how the Zionist Israelis became so extreme in dehumanization of Palestinians. There's many ways to answer that question. I'll just focus on one aspect, and that is the apartheid, the segregation, the separation of Jews and Arabs. In some respects, the conditions of Palestine on the West Bank and Gaza, even before October 7th, I'm talking about, were worse than South African apartheid, because even with the South African apartheid, as horrible as it were, they employed blacks. Blacks could not move freely, but with a pass, they could work in Jayburg and other areas that were white, exclusively white areas. They had to get out of town by nightfall, but they employed large numbers of Black Africans. By the 2000s, that's no longer the case. Earlier, it had been the case, but by the 2000s, it's no longer the case. So you have a complete segregation between the Jewish communities and the Arab communities. So people don't, with some important exceptions, there are some villages that are mixed Jewish and Arab to this day. There are Jewish activists that solidarize with Palestinians. Some of them were killed, by the way, by Hamas on October 7th. So I'm not trying to say that this doesn't exist, that people who break out of that apartheid challenge it and oppose it and try to solidarize across ethnic and religious lines. That is going on. But the predominant problem is if you're not in contact with others of another ethnicity, like the Arabs, it is so easy to fall into a stereotypical image of them. All Arabs are anti-Semites. All Arabs want to drive Jews into the sea. Therefore, the only thing we can do is be as brutal and harsh to them as possible. And one of the real signs of this is, unbelievably to me, is the way that you hear the Israeli government today talk about the Palestinian Authority and saying, oh, they will never allow the Palestinian Authority to run their own independent state because they hate Jews. They don't recognize Israel's right to exist. The Palestinian Authority has been Israel's police force in the West Bank for 30 years now, since the Oslo Accords. I mean, you can't ask for a more willing collaborator than Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority. Yet even that has to be denigrated. So I think that it's the lack of being able to feel empathy for the other when you're isolated and segregated from seeing the other's distress, and you profit economically, socially from the other's distress. Again, more to be said about this really important question, but I think the increasingly apartheid nature of Israel has a lot to do with it. Okay, the Bund, can't help but answer that question, just briefly. If I run on too long, by the way, just cut me off, and I know it's a lot to translate.
No problem. It's no problem, Professor. You are free to just
Okay.
answer everything. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The Bund is a very, very important organization. They were the first nationwide Marxist organization in the Tsarist Empire. It was not Lenin or Plekhanov who formed the first empire-wide Marxist party in Russia. It was the Bund. They did it 2 years before Lenin did. And the reason why Lenin and Plekhanov and Postreyev, etc., founded the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was precisely because they were so embarrassed that they couldn't get their act together to form a unified party. The Bund did it 2 years earlier, and they felt shamed by it, so they rushed to try to form a party before it was really ready. And that had a lot to do with 4 years later, the split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The point is that Lenin learned his organizational principles from the Bund. Lenin did not invent the idea of a centralized vanguard party working under conditions of Tsarist oppression, combining legal and illegal work with principles of democratic centralism. All of that was worked out by the Bund. And at the 1902 Congress, 1903 Congress, in which the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks had their split, the Bund was represented. And at the time, the Bund had 5 times more members than Lenin and Plekhanov's party combined, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks combined. So they were an extremely important organization, but they moved to the right after the 1905 revolution, and then there was other things I won't go into from there, what happened to them. But the main point is that the Bund said, yes, Jews have a right to national self-determination, but they do not need a nation. They argued that you can have national self-determination without a state of your own. You see, if you say that if you support the demand for self-determination by an oppressed people, what that logically means, what logically follows from that, is that those people have the right to determine their own fate, to determine whether they will have a state or not have a state, assimilate into society or try to preserve some kind of cultural autonomy from that society. So the Bund argued that no, the Zionists are wrong. We shouldn't leave Europe and go to the Middle East, where there's people living there for thousands of years that we're going to have to displace from the land. No, we're living here in the Russian Pale, the areas that were largely predominantly Jewish. And there was a massive Jewish proletariat, of course, which was the big engine of the Russian Revolution. We will stay where we are. We will organize as Jews. We will maintain our language, Yiddish, and we will demand cultural autonomy within the areas where Jews live so they can fully practice their religion, they can fully practice their language and their culture, and at the same time work with non-Jewish members of the Russian Empire to overthrow capitalism and create a socialist society. So that was basically their program. My grandfather was a Bundist in the 1920s, long before I was born. And there was always an echo of that in much of the Jewish community, even to this day, even though it's died off a long time ago. Okay, a couple of other things then. The decline of the Zionist left. How did that happen exactly? I think the turning point was 1967. One thing to keep in mind that people forget is that Daniel Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, was actually, of course, all the Israelis were jubilant at winning the 1967 war so quickly. It was a massive victory against all the Arab regimes from the Israeli point of view. Now, from the Palestinian point of view, it was not a victory at all. But a lot of people forget two things. One, Daniel Ben-Gurion, who was a kind of left Zionist, but never really a socialist. I mean, he called himself one for a while, but he never was really serious about it. But he was retired at the time of 1967. He was a bit horrified by the conquest of the West Bank, because he said, wait a second, what are we going to do with 2 million Palestinians now being controlled by Israel? How do you maintain a democratic, supposedly democratic Jewish state, and at the same time incorporate 2 million Palestinians into it? Another little episode you might want to keep in mind, Moshe Dayan, who was the Israeli general who led the Israeli victory in 1967, originally did not intend to conquer either the West Bank or East Jerusalem. He was concentrating on finding the Egyptian and the Syrian army, which was much more powerful than the Jordanian. And at first, the Jordanians held back from invading Israel. Then they did. And then the Israelis defeated the Jordanian army very, very quickly in like a day and a half. And the Jordanian army just fled, and the doors were open to take over East Jerusalem. And of course, subsequently, the West Bank. Moshe Dayan's initial reaction was, why do we need to conquer this? He says, who needs this Jewish Vatican? That's what he referred to the East Jerusalem with the Wailing Wall. He was completely unreligious. So the point is, but with the 67 war and the conquest of all this territory, right, was such a euphoric victory in the eyes of the Zionists that those Zionists who still had a socialist perspective, working cooperatively with Palestinians or trying to, etc., all that just begins to recede, because now there is this sense of, wow, they thought they were stronger than they were. And in a certain sense, there's an old saying, nothing succeeds like success. It's an expression in English. In this case, nothing fails like success, because that took the ground out from under the Zionist left, because the Zionist right was now able to say, we are now in possession of Samaria and Judea, the ancient biblical land of the Jews in the West Bank, and we have to do everything possible to hold on to it. And a left-wing Zionist who argued against that progressively becomes more and more of a minority over time, as more of the Israeli public after 67 basically adopts that point of view. All right, I'll try to be a little briefer on some of the others. The Oslo agreements, did it have disadvantages for the Palestinians? And the Oslo agreements is a complex phenomenon. And it was an opening for a possible peace settlement. It looked like, at least. The problem with the Oslo agreements is that while on the one hand, it did lead the PLO to basically recognize Israel's existence and led to the formation of the Palestinian Authority, but the Oslo agreements kicked the can down the road about all the important issues of resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict, such as what to do with Jewish settlements in the West Bank. That was put to the side. And most importantly, the status of Jerusalem. Now, there is no Palestinian political organization or entity that was or is ever going to agree to move in the direction of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza that excludes Jerusalem. I mean, it's just not going to happen. Arafat came very close to making a deal with Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister in the early 1990s during the Clinton administration, to actually follow up on the Oslo Accords by making a deal with Israel that there would be a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, but Clinton insisted that they can't get Jerusalem. And he said, I can't sell this to my own people. And he pulled out of the deal. And it's all downhill from there. In terms of that was the last really serious effort to have any kind of peaceful rapprochement between the Palestinians and Israelis. And the Israelis proceeded progressively, especially under Netanyahu, to destroy any possibility of a two-state solution. So the two-state solution was never a solution, but it was a proposal that was a stillbirth because of these developments. So yes, it had disadvantages for the Palestinian people, but it was an opening that could have been built upon if a better deal was offered to Palestinians, which was not, and the United States bears a lot of responsibility for that. Okay, so should we heavily criticize the USSR for its support of the creation of the Israeli state? Well, if you're going to criticize Western imperialism and colonialism for the creation of the Israeli state, you better be criticizing the Soviet Union. Otherwise, you'd be a hypocrite. And this is something that is forgotten in much of the left, at least in the United States. I don't know about here in Vietnam, but very few people ever talk about this or even acknowledge the fact that it happened. And some people wave it off by saying that, well, Stalin had a forgetfulness. He forgot to vote the correct way in the UN in 1947. But there was more behind it than that. Yes, the Soviet Union's relationship to this entire Arab-Israeli conflict, there's not much that you can say positive about it, including in the period where it swung over to support of the Arab side. And it has not been a very progressive contribution, to put it mildly. Eric, hello there, Eric. Good to see you again or hear from you. Eric wants to know the need to discuss how to build a movement to stop the war against Gaza. It seems the fighting can't stop without immediate unconditional withdrawal of Israel from both Gaza and the West Bank. What do you think of adding that to the immediate demands of the anti-war movement? That's fine with me. I would have absolutely no objection to that at all. Calling for an immediate and total ceasefire is just the initial first step, right? That's just the immediacy to stop the killing and the genocide. But there's a genocide will be continuing after, even if the fighting stops tomorrow, because there's like 80% of the Palestinians in Gaza are suffering malnutrition and imminent starvation, unless something dramatic is done to reverse this. So an Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza certainly should be a demand of these placed on the Israeli government by the anti-war movement. So I agree with you 100%. But of course, that would require the eviction of the Jewish settlers on the West Bank. Now, I have a little bit of experience with this because when I was a young man back in the 1970s, and I'm from New York City, I knew quite a number of young people who they never were friends of mine, but because I was always a socialist and they were not, the ones I'm talking about, but they were, I guess you can call them kind of liberals. And they went to Israel and they fell in love with the Zionist project, and they came back, and I discovered a number of them had become settlers. Robin Schneider was one of them, had become settlers on the West Bank. And I saw this enormous personality transformation on the part of them. People who were like part of the anti-war movement, who were like, basically like liberal feminists, etc., came back raving racists. There are no more reactionary people I know of in the world than the Jewish settlers on the West Bank. Because they are literally living on land that was literally stolen with their own hands with the assistance of the Israeli army or prompted by the Israeli army. And so the only way you can have and withdrawal does not just mean the Israeli military has to withdraw from the West Bank. The settlers have to withdraw from the West Bank, and that's 650,000 of them, counting East Jerusalem. Now, there's no way that's going to happen without a civil war in Israel. I would prefer that civil war, frankly, if there's going to be one, to be with Jews standing up and opposing those Jewish settlers and having them battle it out. But the odds of that are extremely middle. So we have to be realistic about, we can make a demand. Of course, we make impossible demands all the time. But it's a very difficult situation. The rootedness of those West Bank settlers is a huge problem that is a difficult one to unravel. How can we support the South African case against Israel at the ICJ? Great question. One way is to actually pay attention to, one way is to expose the entire Israeli government's narrative, its claim that it's not committing genocide, and its claim, directed against South Africa of all places, that this charge of genocide against Israel is driven by anti-Semitism. So let me just read you for a second just a passage from the Jerusalem Protocols on anti-Semitism. This was adopted by several dozen Jewish and Arab scholars several years, not that long ago, to try to define what is and is not anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish hatred. So I'm just going to read it for you just for a second. I beg my pardon here. One of the stipulations, it's paragraph 12, says, and I quote, criticizing or opposing Zionism is a form of nationalism or arguing for a variety of constitutional arrangements for Jews and Palestinians in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean is not anti-Semitic. It is not anti-Semitic to support arrangements that accord full equality to all inhabitants between the river and the sea, whether in two states, a binational state, unitary democratic state, federal state, or in whatever form. Okay. So the 84-page document that the South African government has submitted to the Hague Tribunal is a devastating critique of Israel's policies. I have to say that what I find unfortunate about the South African action, not that there's anything bad about what they did vis-a-vis Israel, but South Africa is also supporting currently Russia in its war against Ukraine, which is a bit hypocritical, to put it mildly. Russia has what Russia is doing against Ukraine is in complete identity with what Israel is doing against Gaza. They have bombed 1,100 hospitals and medical clinics, the Russian military. They've killed thousands of Ukrainian children and women, not to mention combat soldiers. So I would hope that this charge against genocide against Israel, once it sticks, and I hope it does, that some of the states in the United Nations would take the same measure against Putin's Russia. Okay. Are a majority of Israelis against the genocide in Gaza? I'm sorry to say the answer is no. And this gets back to the earlier question about what has moved so many Jews to the right in Israel and also overseas who support Israel. I think my mentor, Rai Dunayevskaya, the founder of Marxist humanism, once put it very succinctly to me, and I think, but very profoundly, when she said, wars and holocausts solve nothing. Because people suffer oppression, even such a severe form of oppression as a Holocaust, does not mean they're going to respond to their oppression in a humane way. Some people do, and that's the people that we depend upon and work with and build upon. But many people respond to oppression and dehumanization by internalizing that dehumanization and then projecting it onto others in turn. Just like somebody very often who suffers abuse as a child becomes a very abusive adult. There's a deep psychological issue that we have to bring into this discussion that would be beyond my time span here to go into, but it's something that we have to think very, very deeply about. And
yes,
so,
and I think it was something Frantz Fanon said in his book, Wretched of the Earth. Am I correct? Yeah, it's one of his main arguments. Yeah.
Absolutely. This is why the main point in the Wretched of the Earth is not just the contributions of the national independence movements fighting anti-colonial movements, but his main contribution, his main focus of the book is the pitfalls of the anti-colonial movements. And the reason why he was criticizing the pitfalls of anti-colonial movements at the very moment that they were on the verge of victory. He wasn't celebrating, even though the victory what he lived for so many years was just about to occur, independence from colonialism. He gave that very dire warning, which is why I ended my comments with a quote from him that, the thirst for independence does not necessarily lead to a new humanism. It does not necessarily lead to a new social a social revolution, a social transformation. So in that sense, I think that this question's a complicated one, but I'll leave it at that for now. All right. Can you tell us a bit more about the role and potential of socialist Palestinian groups like the PFLP? Well, just as the Zionist left exists, I mean, I wouldn't say the Zionist left so much. There's really not a Zionist left in Israel anymore. There is a Jewish left. It's small, but the vast majority of people, I would have to say, in Israel have responded to the trauma of October 7th by by buying into the government narrative. That may change, but it's not going to change anytime soon. And people who are on the left and who you would have expected up until now to be on the right side of this issue are in one way or another supporting Israel's actions. Now, that's not true of all Israelis. If you read Haaretz, the main left-wing Jewish newspaper in Israel, they have condemnations of Zionism and Netanyahu's government that would make your fingers burn. They're sharper than anything I've ever written. So that opposition is there, but it's a shrunken minority. It's a minority position, just like the position of the PFLP and the Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine, George Habash's organization. He's no longer with us, but these were Marxist-Leninist tendencies within the Palestinian liberation movement, and they were completely they're marginalized. They're very they still exist on paper at least, but they're very small, and they don't have much influence. They were overshadowed by the compromises that the Palestinian Authority made in terms of their implementation, such as it was of the Oslo agreements. But more importantly, they were representing a kind of secular Arab nationalism that throughout, not just in the Middle East, but not just in Palestine, but throughout the Middle East, has been submerged by religious fundamentalism. So they're marginalized. Okay, let me just see a couple of the 17 more, so I'm not going to get to everything. So I'll take one more here, and then give you a chance to inform our Vietnamese speakers of some of these points.
Yes, I think Thuận Nguyên Ming's question seems to be very popular, so I think you should try to address that. Yes.
Which question is that?
Yeah, it's the question posted at just I think 10 minutes earlier. It says the most Vietnamese now, all of they are nationalists and they support the Israeli government in attack on Gaza, 7th of October. So they think Gaza Palestinians is Hamas and Hamas is terrorists. So they never support the liberation struggle movement of the Palestinians. And they also justify the decisions by saying that, oh, the national benefits should be placed on the top of the agenda. The Israeli supports the Vietnamese army by providing them with tanks and weapons. And what should we do to raise the knowledge of this particular issue to Vietnamese people and to rally for more support for the Palestinians? So I think the essence of the question is that I think the dominant discourse in Vietnam surrounding the Israel and Gaza war is dominated by hardcore nationalists in Vietnam who seem to uncritically praise Israel and its actions in Gaza by stating that, oh, it's for their national benefit, is justified defense. And of course, this argument is bogus, but I think Thuận Nguyên Minh is trying to ask how can we counter this particular narrative and to support the Palestinian struggle.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I think we're not going to be able to win the argument against those nationalists if we don't acknowledge, and this is true of anyone anywhere in the world, within the left especially, if we don't acknowledge and be very frank and be honest about it, that Hamas's attack on October 7th was a horrific deed. And the ideology of Hamas is a reactionary right-wing ideology, and it has been that way for a long, long time. And not just Hamas, of course, since the Houthis have just entered this conflict very directly with the United States in Yemen. Let me just read you what is one of the main slogans of the Houthi government in Yemen. It is, "Death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews." Well, that is anti-Semitism, right? To condemn an entire people, ethnicity, and religion for the actions of a government. So we have to begin there by making that clear. But secondly, then one has to say, I think, that what has produced the conditions that allow for the radicalization of much of the Palestinian movement in the direction of Islamic fundamentalism on the one side and corrupt opportunism in the Palestinian Authority on the other side is Israeli policies. Israel has deliberately structured its policies for decades now to ensure that the most radical Islamic fundamentalist elements survive and persist until October 7th, at least. That was their strategy. keep Hamas alive, because that divides the Palestinian movement, and it also gives it a bad name around the world. And therefore, people like in Vietnam too would, if there's an attack by Hamas which kills civilians, the knee-jerk reaction will be to say, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, and so it can't be doing all that bad in what it's doing. So we have to be able to state very clearly that Hamas was in part formed by the Israelis. When Hamas was first starting out, the Israelis armed them. They didn't only allow them to get money, they armed them because they wanted to create a split in the Palestinian movement, because the Palestinian, what's now the Palestinian Authority, formerly the PLO, was moving in the direction of a peace agreement with Israel, which the revisionist Zionists, now called the Likud party of Netanyahu, and before them Shamir and Begin, adamantly opposed a two-state solution, even though at some point they would pretend to be for it. So I think you have to say, look, Israel has constructed the situation, and in recent years, Netanyahu made no secret of this, he allowed the Qataris to send billions of dollars into Gaza, that everybody knew Hamas was using some of that money for weapons. And the Israelis said, well, but it's not a big deal. Every couple of years, we can come in and mow the grass, blow up some buildings or whatnot when they shoot off rockets, but then they'll quiet down. We can keep going like this forever. And October 7th suddenly made it very real to the Israelis that is not going to go on forever like this. So I think that's the second thing to really emphasize to people, that Israel has worked to construct a kind of political situation that would prevent the independent, liberatory Palestinian voice from getting open expression within its areas of occupation. Obviously, within the Palestinian diaspora, there are all kinds of expressions of those liberatory expressions, including, of course, within Palestine itself. But Israel has worked very, very hard to repress that. So I think that we also have to say that Israel is very clever. And there's a long history. A lot of people don't realize, guess who it was that formed an alliance with the first independent country in sub-Saharan Africa that came to power as the vanguard of the anti-colonial revolutions in the 1950s in Africa? Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana. And Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana had a close alliance with Ben-Gurion's Israel, and Israel helped develop, train, and arm the Ghanaian army. Oh, far back then, right? Politics make for strange bedfellows. So the Israelis learned a long time ago. They also, of course, armed the South African government in their suppression of the anti-apartheid resistance. And the arms industry is a huge source of the Israeli economy. And so they work very hard to cultivate contacts in various countries around the world in order to provide governments with what they would like to get from the Israelis, which is surveillance equipment, high-tech military devices, etc. So we also have to show that this is not exactly altruistic reasons, that there may be that connection.
Thank you, Professor. And I think there is one other question. I think I will be asking one other question before we wrap up the meeting, because I know it is quite late there in Chicago. So I think Chi Mentry.
I'm not going anywhere, so it's fine with me.
Okay, so in any case, I think it's good to just wrap things up early. Okay. So Chi asked one question that I think is actually quite crucial. Dear Professor, what do you think is the best solution for the 700,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank? Is it possible to dismantle all of these illegal settlements, or are there any other solutions? I think you partially addressed this in your previous answers, but I think this is like an important issue that deserves like a lot more pointed attention. Yeah, so I think I hope you can address this question for Chi.
Yes. Well, the settlers in the West Bank are living an incredibly, in general, a much higher standard of living than most Israeli Jews. They get all kinds of benefits. They get all kinds of government assistance and aid. They are protected by the Israeli military constantly 24 hours. There is a complete apartheid segregation system that's operative in the West Bank, with different zones where Palestinians can go, but Jews can't, and vice versa, etc. Nathan Thrall, maybe I'll put in the chat, Nathan Thrall has just published a very interesting story about a day in the life of one Palestinian in the West Bank that kind of documents that kind of impact of the Jewish settlements on the life of making Palestinians so miserable and degraded in the West Bank. There's many other studies as well, of course, that one could read about this. So it's going to be very, very hard. You're not going to convince by argument or persuasion the settlers to leave. They view that they are sitting on, holy land that was taken away from Jews 2,000 years ago, and now finally Jews got it back, and they're not going to let it go. By the way, it's a very strange argument, because if you look at a map, even the most, we don't really know what all the borders of ancient Judea and Israel were like 2,000 or 1,000 or 1,500 years or 2,500 years ago. But one thing that is for sure is that the Mediterranean coast, except for a little tiny section, was never under the control of any Jewish kingdom, either Judah or Israel or the United Kingdom under David and Solomon. So therefore, if you want to be literal about this, the Jews would have to evacuate Tel Aviv because that was run by the Phoenicians, just like Gaza was run by the Philistines and Ashkelon up the coast and other areas further north. So, but the point is that the settlers are very reactionary. They're very ideologically driven, they're very committed, and they're very, very armed. And they're committing pogroms against Palestinians on a regular basis, as you know, on the West Bank. So it's not the first time, however, it's not like there's not a precedent for removing Jewish settlers by government decree. There were 8,000 Jewish settlers in Gaza as of 2005, when Israel decided to pull out of Gaza and allow the Palestinians to have it under their control. Although within 2 years, of course, they imposed a complete blockade on Gaza and made it into an open-air prison when Hamas won the elections in Gaza. But there were 8,000 Jewish settlers, and when the deal was made to pull out of Gaza, they told the 8,000 Jewish settlers, you're going to have to leave. Now, the Jewish settlers were furious, and they refused to leave. So the Israeli army came in there and kicked them out. So it can happen. Now, 8,000 isn't 600 or 700,000, obviously. But it's not like it can't be done. It's not like it's physically impossible, but it would cause, even that 8,000 eviction back in 2005 caused a real deep divisions in Israeli society, right? And came close to toppling a government. So magnify that today, it's going to be even a much more difficult issue. So I think the fundamental thing is, I'm sorry to have to put it this way, but Israel's policies are not just harming Palestinians. Israel's policies are even harming its own narrow understanding of its national self-interest. I think Israel is committing suicide by what it's doing in Gaza. It has no strategy to get out. It cannot eliminate Hamas completely. For every one Hamas fighter it kills, they have to kill 10 civilians to get to that one. They can't kill 500,000 people and get away with it, even though some in Israel wouldn't mind that. They don't have an exit strategy. They don't have a concept of what to do with Gaza once the war is over. So it's undermining its own basis of existence. So it's going to take it may have to take a dramatic defeat for Israelis to realize that they have to go in a different path, and that the price to pay for maintaining some semblance of Jewish self-determination is to get rid of this entire ideology that has prevailed for all these decades, which is embodied in the Jewish settlers in the West Bank most of all. So I don't want to see a violent outcome of this conflict, but I'm not going to support those who engage in violence against civilians without any concern for a recognition that there's a difference between the government and the people of a country, of a given country. Even if many of them support that government, there's two worlds in every country. But it's going to be a very, very hard struggle. So I don't have an easy answer to your question, but it's not outside the realm of possibility that if an Israeli government came to power with enough popular support saying we have to reverse direction given the disaster that we've walked into, it might, that's the only thing I can see of being able to have the political strength to take on directly the Jewish settlers and say, okay, you have to give that land back to the land has to be given back to the Palestinians. And you're free to live somewhere else in Israel if you want, like anybody else, or you're free to live somewhere else. But you can't continue with this apartheid system. This has got to go.
Thank you, Professor. And as an addendum, I have recently watched a podcast that Dr. Norman Finkelstein made some time ago, I think during the 2021 bombing of Gaza. And I think he touched on this particular issue of the settlers in the West Bank. And I think he proposed like a quick solution in that the best way for the settlers to move is to just remove all of the IDF protection from the West Bank. But I think it is becoming a lot more unfeasible now because, well, followers of the Israeli politics may know that the Minister of Public Security in Israel has been distributing M16s to the settlers. So I think that may cause Finkelstein's proposal to be a lot more difficult because they are depending on their own weapons to defend themselves instead of defending themselves under the umbrage or under the protection of the IDF. So I think your point about how Israel is burying itself is absolutely correct here. And Ben Gvir's behavior is now really digging Israel's own grave by extrematizing and just radicalizing Israeli society. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. If I could just add one point to that, a factor to keep in mind are the Haredim, that is the extremely religious Jews, sometimes called Hasidim, which are only about 5% of Jews in around the world are part of this religious tendency, super religious, hyper-Orthodox. It's a very interesting tradition that had actually some progressive roots back in the 1700s when it was first formed in Poland and parts of Eastern Europe. But and some of the Hasidim actually are anti-Zionist. The Satmar Hasidim, for instance, are fiercely anti-Zionist. And you'll see them at many of the pro-Palestine demonstrations carrying Palestinian flags. But the vast majority of the Haredim, that is the extreme religious Jews who are part of this sect, various dozens of Hasidic sects, they came over to support Zionism by the 1960s, most of them. And a large percentage of them are settlers in the West Bank. And they believe in having as large families as possible. They interpret the lesson that they say they learned from the Holocaust is Jews must propagate as much as possible. They have the highest birth rates of anybody in the Middle East, and generally an average of 8 children per family. So their population has grown exponentially. That's one reason why the population of the Jewish settlers has grown so large. So this is a demographic time bomb also that's afflicting Israel, both in the West Bank and within Israel proper. And that explains, in part, comes back to the early question, the very good earlier question about what explains the decline of left Zionism and also the insensitivity to the dehumanization of the Palestinians, is that these hyper-religious Jews have overshadowed to a large extent the influence and power of secular Jews, which is one reason this big crisis in the judicial system in Israel that got kicked up over the past year and a half that preceded the October 7th attack was such a divisive issue, and that was such an important one in weakening Netanyahu's support. But Netanyahu now, of course, is simply trying to extend the war as long as possible because he knows, as well as everybody else, that the day the war ends, he'll be out of power. He'll have a lot of explaining to do. So it's in his self-interest and the military, the IDF's chief of staff, it's in their interest for this war to go on as long as possible. But again, there's no exit that they have, and so they are burying themselves by this kind of approach.
Thank you, Professor. And I think I should wrap up this particular webinar. Thank you, everyone, for participating. And thank you, Professor, especially for your time and for your, I would say, tireless efforts at answering far too many questions. So thank you, Professor, and please have a good day.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Và xin cảm ơn tất cả mọi người vì đã tham gia buổi họp ngày hôm nay. Và do giờ thì đã khá muộn vào buổi sáng giờ Hà Nội và buổi họp kéo dài khá lâu, nên mình xin phép xin được tập hợp lại tất cả các câu hỏi và xin dịch các câu trả lời của thầy Hudis bằng một bài đăng ở trên nhóm Việt Nam Young Marxist, và bài đăng này sẽ xuất hiện trên nhóm trong khoảng tầm 2 và 3 ngày nữa. Cảm ơn tất cả mọi người vì đã lắng nghe và chúc mọi người một ngày vui vẻ. And that concludes our meeting. Thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you.
And I hope to see you in Vietnam in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank
Yes,
you,
thank you.
Peter. Thank you, Hiếu. Okay, thank you, everyone.